What is going on, Chess YouTube? So in today's video, we're looking at one of Magnus Carlsen's latest and greatest games where he steals a relatively new opening idea used by Ding Liren against Gukesh D in their World Championship match. This game is Magnus Carlsen versus ante from the 2024 World Rapid Championships, that is before Magnus Carlsen quit the tournament. And here we go. In the game, Magnus Carlsen opens one knight f3, ante goes d5, then we have e3, knight f6, and b3. This opening, of course, was popularized recently by Hikaru Nakamura. He plays it constantly in Blitz for some reason. I don't see the appeal of it personally, but Hikaru likes it quite a bit. Now, obviously, the idea is you have the option of going bishop b2, and then you are flexible with whatever else you want to do. For example, you can go bishop e2, bishop b5, maybe short castles, maybe not, maybe d4, maybe not, maybe c4, maybe not. Overall, it's a very flexible opening setup for white. Now here, what is the idea for black? Well, in the game, he does go bishop f5, sort of playing in the spirit of the London system. And overall, this is thought to be one of the strongest lines, if not the strongest lines by black against this setup. If you are looking for a good option against this e3, knight f3, b3 opening system by white, then playing for a reverse London is certainly a good choice. And it was the choice used by Gukesh D in his World Championship match game against Ding Liren. All right, now here, the main move for white typically is bishop b2, but Magnus, he has this very specific idea in mind. He wants to copy Ding Liren, and he does go bishop e2. Now, this is sort of a waiting move here. White is waiting for the move h6 by black. It's a very common move, the point being, if white goes knight h4 later in the game, then black will have h7 as a good retreat square for that bishop. He will keep that very important London-system bishop alive. Now, beyond that, you can't just go e6 right away, but the problem with that move is you do risk losing that light square bishop to the knight. Now here, in this game, black did go h6, so far so good, and here is where Magnus Carlsen stole the new idea used by Ding Liren against Gukesh D in their World Championship match game. He plays the move bishop to a3. Now, what is the idea behind this move? It's very simple. Now, e6 by black would be very dubious, then Magnus would capture on f8, removing black's right to castle after he recaptured the king or the rook. Of course, once the king or the rook moves, you no longer have the right to castle on that side of the board, so this is a very serious threat. To deal with the threat, here black goes knight bd7, that is the main idea. Then you go e6, the point being if white takes on f8, that is the best move for white. Then you can recapture with the knight, and so far we are pretty much following the exact sequence of moves used by Ding Liren and Gukesh D again in their World Championship match. Very interesting to get a sequel of this line so soon. All right, now here Magnus, he continues. c4, putting pressure on the center. Black is going to be forced to go either e6 or c6 here to bolster that pawn. In the game, he does go e6, opening up this line of attack with the bishop. Now, of course, bishop takes f8 was the move. That is the whole idea of this line. Now we have knight takes f8 and then short castle. So here, Magnus, he gets what he wants. Black has wasted one tempo and then probably two tempos going knight 7, f8, then knight back to d7. Overall, wasting two tempos with that knight. And that means white is going to be a little bit faster in this game to get his plans going. All right, now here, knight 8, d7 is the move. And now here, Magnus has a choice. He can take on d5 or go d4 or do something else. Now, in the Ding Liren versus Gukesh D game, Ding did take on d5, and he actually delayed d4 for a very long time, and that is what Magnus goes for here in this game. He starts c takes d5. Now black has the option taking back with the pawn or the knight. In the game, he does recapture with the pawn. E takes d5. And now instead of d4, here Magnus plays the much stronger move. That is simply b4. Starting the minority attack on the queen side, but before you play the move d4. Very, very clever. All right, now here, black, how should he continue? Well, it turns out the strongest move here for black is the immediate c6. You want to clamp down on that b5 square and discourage the immediate b5 from white. Now, instead of that here, he does simply castle. Short castle is the move for ante, but this turns out to be a slight inaccuracy, and here white can simply go b5 immediately, clamping down on that c6 square in advance. Now, instead of that here, white does go knight to c3, a perfectly fine move by Magnus, but it does give black the option of going c6, and here Arjan does play it. So, c6 played in the game, And overall here, Magnus does have a very small but very stable advantage. Having that pawn on d2 instead of d4 does give him the option of going knight d4 later in the game. And overall, white is going to have quite a bit of pressure in the center and on the queen side here with that classic minority attack, potentially going a5 or a4, then b5, and so on. All right, now here Magnus, it is his turn to move. He continues, queen b3, sliding over his queen. Now, how is black going to proceed? Well, he has a few different options. For example, rook e8 is playable. You can also go knight to e4, bishop g4, a6, and so on. In the game, though, rook e8 played by black, a very solid, very flexible move. Now, here Magnus, he also has many different options here. For example, both b5 and a4 are playable. You can also go say, I don't know, rook b1, rook fc1, and so on. But in the game, b5 played by Magnus, immediately getting that minority attack going in the game. All right, now here, of course, white has a lot of different threats. If you take on b5 with the pawn, that would be a massive mistake. You weaken that pawn on b5 as well as the pawn on d5. So with that in mind here, the computer does like the move. Simply bishop e6, retreating the bishop back and getting it centralized a little bit more and threatening ideas like d4 with the discovered attack on the queen and the new attack on the knight on c3. So overall, bishop e6 is the top engine line here, but instead of that, queen to a5 played by black in the game. And this turns out to be a little bit dubious. The queen is not so well placed on a5. And here Magnus is going to have a field day trying to slowly increase his advantage in this game. All right, he continues. Rook fc1, sliding his rook over. Of course, c takes b5, again, is not a real threat yet. The queen on e5 just isn't doing all that much for his position. All right, now here black continues. Knight c5. Jumping in with the knight, hitting the queen, a very active move, but Magnus does find the best retreat square for the queen. Now, there are two good squares, d1 and b2, but it turns out d1 is a little bit better, and that is what Magnus does. So, queen d1 played, and now, very importantly, this rook on f1, it's over, on the c1 square, the rooks are connected despite the queen being on his original square, and that is definitely to Magnus Carlsen's benefit. His rooks will be very active on, say, c1 and b1 maybe later in the game. All right, now here, black, what are his options? Well, that knight on c5 is a little bit misplaced. There are a few different squares you can move it to. For example, e6 is decent, but d3 may actually be the strongest square for the knight, hitting the rook on c1 immediately and just being very annoying in general. That would force out bishop takes d3, and then bishop takes back, and you would knock off that very important light square bishop for white, and overall black would be doing relatively okay. So knight d3 is the star move here, but instead knight e6 played in the game by Ariantari. All right, now Magnus, he increases the pressure. B takes c6, then b takes, then queen to a4, flying over with the queen, and offering the queen trade. Very interesting, Magnus. The idea being, if you trade queens, queen takes, then knight takes, that knight on a4 will have very good access to the c5 square, and overall, white would have a lot of pressure, and not to mention Magnus being the best endgame player ever. Obviously, he's almost always happy to trade into an endgame where his endgame skills really flourish. So here, black, his best move is to avoid the queen trade. He does that. Queen b6 play. Don't worry, queens are staying on the board for a very long time in this game. All right, now Magnus, he finally goes d4. This move surprised me a little bit. I mean, after all, when you go d4, you lose the option of going knight d4 later in the game. It's a very important resource. So d4, despite being a very logical-looking move, it is quite committal. You do lose a lot of flexibility of your setup here that Ding Liren used against Gukesh D in their World Championship match. All right, now, Ariantari, how should he continue? Well, here he's got a lot of different options as well, but the main idea is to get those rooks over onto the c8 and b8 squares. Either of those moves would be fine. Rook b8, rook e c8, and so on. Beyond that, moves like a5 and c5 are also playable. In the game, a5 was played by Ariantari, gaining space on the queen side. Very interesting. But Magnus is ready for that, and he simply goes queen d1, sliding back with the queen. All right, now here, Arian. This is where he really starts to go astray. He goes knight d7, retreating the knight back, potentially intending c5 or something like that, but overall this move is a little bit slow. Again, instead, rook e c8 or rook a b8 were the preferable options. Now here Magnus, he continues knight to a4. That being one of the key ideas behind queen d1 played earlier is, of course, freeing up that a4 square for the knight. Now the knight hits b6, it controls c5, and so on. That knight, despite being on the rim, is perfectly placed. All right, queen b7 is the move for black, retreating the queen, and now white here has many different ways to proceed in the game. He just goes bishop d3, offering the bishop trade on d3. that bishop on f5 is quite active compared to the white counterpart. So Magnus here trying to trade it off and trying to get sort of a queens, knights, and rooks middle game. All right, bishop takes d3, then queen takes, and then we have queen b4, flying in with the queen and pressuring the knight on a4. Now, very importantly, if white goes knight to c5, then black can simply trade on c5, damaging white's pawn structure, and black would be doing relatively well. So with that in mind here, white, it is in his best interest to leave the knight on a5 for now, and he does that with the move queen d1, supporting the knight, defending it in advance. And now, how is black going to proceed? Well, he goes rook e to c8, finally sliding his rook over to the c file. That is very important, but now Magnus, he's ready. He goes rook a b1, hitting the queen on b4. Now, where is the queen going to go? There are a few different squares. For example, d6 and e7 are the best squares, but it turns out e7 is a little bit better than the other one, d6. But in the game, Ariantari, being just a regular low-level GM, he goes queen d6, and this move is slightly inaccurate. Now here, Magnus, he has a way to increase the pressure immediately. That is the very strong move, knight to e5, jumping in with the knight, potentially attending knight d3, and the point being, taking on e5 is actually a very dubious idea from black's perspective. So overall, knight e5 would be a tremendously strong move. Instead here, knight b6 played in the game, and this move is maybe a little bit premature. Here, black takes back, knight takes b6, then we have rook takes b6. And real fast, guys, I do want to point out, for some reason, the eval bar on the left is simply not working properly. I want to show you real fast. If you play a move like queen takes h2, it doesn't move, so it's just frozen. Just hang with me here. I'm going to do my best to explain the game as we go along here. So now here, black, what are his options? Well, you can challenge the rook on b6 immediately with, say, rook a b8. That is playable. Beyond that, black in the game did go queen to a3, flying down with the queen. All right, now here, Magnus. He is in control. He has quite a bit of pressure on that pawn on c6. But here, he just takes a single moment to get rid of any future back rank mating ideas, and he does just go h3. All right, now here, Ariantari, he goes c5, breaking on the queen side. Not a bad idea in principle, but Magnus, of course, is ready. He goes rook b3, flying back with the rook, tempting black to trade on a2, but he does not do that in the game. Instead, queen to a4 played, making sure his queen can get out of there if it needs to. Now, d takes c5 is the move, and here it turns out, black, it is very important for him to go rook a b8, challenging that white rook on b3 immediately. Now, instead of that here, rook takes c5 played in the game, and this turns out to be a very critical mistake. It turns out after the trade of rooks, after rook takes c5, then knight takes, white has a very dominant position. He wins that pawn on d5, queen takes d5 played in the game, and now, of course, there is no time for knight takes b3, as then queen takes a8, wins the rook on a8 with check against the king, and this is where Magnus really starts to just pull away with this game. All right, rook c8 played, defending the knight. Now we have rook c3, once again piling up on that knight, and now, very importantly, that knight is pinned. If it retreats, say, knight e6, then you lose the rook on c8 on the spot. So Magnus here, being up a pawn and increasing the pressure, things are not looking good for black. All right, queen b4 played in the game, defending that knight, but of course, the knight is still pinned to the rook on c8. Black will have to be very, very careful. All right, Magnus continues. Rook c1, defending the rook. Then we have queen a3, maintain the defense of the knight on c5 and pressuring the rook on c1. Then we have rook c4, getting out of the attack, but giving up that pawn on a2 if black wants it. Here, black does take that pawn. Queen takes a2, a very questionable decision, as now white is going to be officially up an entire piece, that being the knight on f3. So, rook takes c5 played in the game. Black goes queen b1, delivering the back rank threat, giving the check on the first rank, and now we are seeing the benefit of the move h3 played earlier by Magnus. Of course, if that move h3 was not played right here, then it would be mate after, say, rook e1, queen takes, queen d1, queen takes, knight e1, queen takes, and that would be all she wrote. But thankfully, Magnus did play h3, and he's not losing here. All right, king h2 played in the game, getting out of the attack. Then we have rook takes and queen takes. And now here, Magnus is literally up an entire piece. I mean, black's only chance is to win in time pressure, but here, Magnus being the GOAT, at least when he doesn't quit tournaments prematurely, he should be able to win this. All right, a4 played by black, then knight d4, then queen to b2, and now here, Magnus finds the finishing sequence. Queen c8 hits the king, forces king h7, and then queen to c2 with the double attack on the king on h7 and the queen on b2. This does force out queen takes, then knight takes, and at that point, obviously, Magnus being up a knight, soon to be up a pawn as well, that would be too much, and for that reason here, Ariane Tari, the low-level GM, he resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a game between Magnus Carlsen and Ariane Tari in the 2024 World Rapid Championships. Alright, Chess YouTube, hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, smash that like button. And check out this video right here, where I covered yet another one of Magnus Carlsen's best games from the 2024 World Rapid Championships before he quit the tournament. If you want to see more Magnus action from that tournament, check that game out, and I'll see you in the next video.